It didn't announce it, but it says.
We're going. Welcome to the Wednesday, June 15, 2020 hybrid meeting of the Thurston County Planning Commission. The Thurston County Planning Commission is a citizens advisory commission to the Board of County Commissioners on land use planning matters such as comprehensive plan, zoning ordinance, and zoning ordinance amendments. Planning Commission actions are in the form of recommendations to the county commissioners, who are the final decision makers. All Planning Commission meetings are open to the public. Citizens are welcome to observe all Planning Commission briefings and work sessions. Public comment is allowed on those topics for which a public hearing has not yet been held. To start off tonight, we're going to do introductions. I'm Eric Casino. I'm this season's chair of the Planning Commission, and I represent District 2. We'll start down here with
Jim Simmons, District 3.
Derek Day, District 1.
I'm Helen Wheatley, District 1.
Doug Carmen, District 2. Barry Halverson, District 2, Youngmore.
And I believe we have Commissioner Hanson online.
That's right, Joel Hanson, District 3.
And did Kevin's in the bottom. Oh, and then Commissioner Petzinger.
This is Kevin Pestinger, District 1.
Thank you. With that, we will take a look at our agenda for today. Everybody had an opportunity to review it. And if so, entertain a motion.
I move to accept the agenda.
Second.
The motion has been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on the agenda? Hearing none, we'll call for the vote.
Commissioner Casino,
Aye.
Commissioner Carmen,
Aye.
Commissioner Halverson,
Aye.
Commissioner Wheatley,
Aye.
Commissioner Hanson,
Aye.
Commissioner Simmons,
All right.
Commissioner Day,
Aye.
Commissioner Pessinger.
Aye.
The agenda has been approved. Thank you very much. Next up, we will be looking at the minutes from prior meetings. First would be the May 18th, 2022 meetings.
I move to accept the minutes for the May 18, 2022. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on the meeting minutes from May 18th, 2022? With that, I would, the motion on the floor is to approve the meeting minutes and accept the audio as the official meeting record. With that, we'll call for the vote.
Commissioner Casino,
Aye.
Commissioner Carmen,
Aye.
Commissioner Halverson,
Aye.
Commissioner Nelson,
Aye.
Commissioner Wheatley,
Aye.
Commissioner Hanson,
Aye.
Commissioner Simmons,
All right.
Commissioner Day,
Aye.
Commissioner Pessinger.
Aye.
Thank you for approval of those minutes. We'll now look at the June 1st, 2022 meeting minutes.
I move to approve the June 1st meeting minutes and accept the audio as the official whatever it is.
Record.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion on the June 1st, 2022 minutes? Hearing none, we'll call for the vote on accepting the meeting minutes and accepting the audio as the official meeting record.
Commissioner Casino,
Aye.
Commissioner Carmen,
Aye.
Commissioner Halverson,
Aye.
Commissioner Nelson,
Aye.
Commissioner Wheatley, Commissioner Hanson,
Aye.
Commissioner Simmons,
All right.
Commissioner Day,
Aye.
Commissioner Pessinger.
Aye.
Thank you very much for approving the meeting minutes of June 1st, 2022. At this point, we'll be moving towards the public communication portion of the meeting. So there's some ground rules for this. Those participating via Zoom, please choose the raise your hand option if you wish to address the Planning Commission. You'll be promoted to a panelist when it's your turn to speak. This may take a few seconds. Unmute yourself and turn on your camera to be heard. If you're dialing in, press *9 to raise your hand. Make sure you also choose the *6 to unmute yourself. A 3-minute timer will show on one of the video screens to help track time. If you have any issues speaking or being heard, please disconnect from the Zoom meeting and call 360-972-6785 to make your public comment. We're going to start with online comment, and then we'll do boardroom comments if we could. If there's anybody online that would like to address the Planning Commission, please raise your hand.
Dorothy Lyons.
Dorothy Lyon, you're up. Dorothy, you'll have to unmute yourself.
Okay, thanks very much.
Great, thank you.
Hi, first I'd like to thank the commissioners and staff for the work that you take on in addressing these difficult issues on behalf of us all. I really do appreciate it and very sincerely thank you. Second, I just wanted to kind of point out, make a note for the record that there appears to have been some misunderstandings that resulted for the document publicly posted for today's wireless work session in side comments attributing some inaccurate assertions to the citizen stakeholders that I do not believe were ever made. For example, that the DC Circuit Court of Appeals decision in Environmental Health Trust versus FCC means that the FCC's regulations have been overturned. We are fully aware that current safety guidelines.
One moment, Dorothy. I'm sorry, but we are not taking any more comment on something that we've
No, I'm
already.
sorry. I
public
only
hearing on.
wanted to make a note that there were some inaccurate assertions about what the stakeholders said in the side comments. And I want to ask you to please not let that misrepresentation influence your consideration of our work.
Mr. Nelson, does that address your point of order?
Well, yeah, I mean, we can't take comment on this. It doesn't matter if she wants,
Correcting a record?
yeah. I mean, that's something that you're gonna have to take to staff and they can come back to us with. But we can't take public comment on things that we've already held a hearing on.
Okay, I thought I was just trying to clarify for the record some inaccuracies, but okay, I'm sorry. I apologize for being out of order. And again, thank you all for your difficult and diligent efforts on the public's behalf. I really do appreciate it and thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody else online that would like to address the Planning Commission? All right, seeing nobody else online, we'll move to the boardroom. The first we have on the list would be Christy White.
Good evening, commissioners. Can you hear me okay? Just to echo the previous speaker, thanks for all the hard work that you're doing and staff as well, who worked very, very hard on a number of issues. And I just wanted to be that little reminder that, you know, we have many issues before you. They all require great depth of diligence and work and consideration, and encourage you to look for the middle ground, to continue to ask for questions and more information that will help give you answers that are complete, and that you have all the information that you need and all of the possibilities that are before you. I encourage you, for those of you who have an interest in minority reports on the various topics that are before you, to pursue those and submit those to continue to push the envelope for information. So thank you again for all the hard work. I do appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Christy. Up next, we have Phyllis Farrell. Oh, you don't need to. Oh, I'm sorry. But thanks for coming anyways, Phyllis. Is there anybody else in the?
Thank you for your service.
Seeing nobody else in the boardroom, we'll move on to our next item on the agenda, which would be number 4, continued business, which would be a work session on the Shoreline Master Program with planner Andrew Defoe.
Good evening, commissioners. I'm just taking a moment to get. That's what I want. Yes, okay, good. So tonight, the Planning Commission will continue its review of the draft Shoreline Master Program and provide questions and feedback to staff on the draft recommendation to the board and help continue to shape that document. We're working from a draft that was dated May 18th, 2022. That includes changes made since the October 2021 public hearing, which includes requests from the Planning Commission, items that the public brought forward in their comments, and items, ongoing work between county staff and ecology. So tonight, the plan is to focus on chapters 19,400 through 700, I believe. So I was going to start at the top of 19,400, and for lack of having a better plan, rather than go page by page, it's going to have us go section by section. I think that's the, oh, yes, thank you.
I have a couple of comments on 200.
Let me share the screen first. The chapters are large enough that we want to, have some semblance of flow. All right, so folks online should now be seeing the document. That'll get us to the right page and we can. Did I hear someone say there might be comments from further back?
Yes,
And where were those?
at 19,200, 115 to 125, I guess. It's regarding Lamberts.
Okay,
And it looks to me as though, they've been taken out of urban conservancy and rural conservancy.
so on all of the descriptions of the shoreline environment designations, they have all been amended to essentially mirror what's in the WACs. So, because we had language that was not perfectly consistent with the Washington Administrative Code and ecology's descriptions for the shoreline environment designations. And so per their recommendation, the proposal would be to use language consistent with the WACs. So that's what's in here just for context, and open up for your discussion.
Go ahead, Commissioner Wheatley.
Yeah, I noticed that as well, but you may recall when I was, we were talking about some of the reaches and things.
Yeah.
That I had found that the shoreline residential was not quite as consistent with the language put forward by ecology as the other ones, like urban conservancy or whatever. And I seem to recall that in the recommended language, it said, it specified that shoreline residential referred to, they didn't use the word Lammerts, but they referred to essentially what were Lammerts, and then to urban areas. And that language, I pointed out at the time, that language was pulled out, and so that is still the case. It's still not in there. It's a slightly, for all the other ones, all the other designations, it mirrors, but for shoreline residential, it's slightly different than what was in the ecology language.
When did Lambert's fall out? For the May 18th draft?
I'd have to look at this specifically. It looks like it, yes. So all the strike through and underline that we're looking at here are things that were changed from October 2021 to May 18th. Yeah,
And
so since the public hearing.
And specifically, the reason for pulling Lambert's out was to have the language mirror
Yeah, so
ecology's language.
right. So when we were going through all the shoreline environment designations that the public had brought up, there was some conversation about how the language in the draft SMP didn't match what was on like the staff presentations. And that's because staff presentations were built off of the SED report, which is really where all these SEDs came from. And that language more closely mirrored ecology language. So with the May 18th draft that we're now working from, I have made the SEDs descriptions consistent with the SED report and also looking at the WAC. So if I missed something or there was an inaccuracy there, I can look at that. But the intent was to start from a place of we're carrying this over from state guidelines and going with that.
Just to clarify, my note right here, I just noticed that I have a little note on that. It's in section B on the designation criteria that it seems to have fallen out.
Go ahead, Commissioner Halverson.
Yeah, I noticed the same thing because when I went back through I didn't have this document, thank you for bringing it today, but I went through the online piece of it. And I didn't see it in there as being cross-checked, but what I did is, because there's two definitions in there, medium and high density residential development services. But the definitions section 150 doesn't define medium and high density.
Right.
So I would think that high density would be like Lambert's. I mean, because that's how we equated it when we did our SED identification.
And
So
it could be, so these designation criteria, I mean, it's a blanket that's applied countywide, and so it's broad and it's policy language. But then you look also at the ground and what's the existing conditions. So just because something is zoned a higher density, and I think each jurisdiction needs to fit those descriptions to their zoning ordinances, but just because it's zoned, that doesn't necessarily mean it developed that way. And so the development pattern also influences those shoreline environment designations. And that's why if you look out, you look out across the, say the marine shorelines, for example, you'll see plenty of areas that are zoned Lammerd, but are proposed to be rural conservancy simply because the pattern of development doesn't match that higher intensity zoning. They just didn't develop that close to the shoreline or that close together at this time.
Right. So my question is, we put in the new language, we put medium and high density residential developments, but we don't define it.
Right. So that's the purpose of what that section is. The purpose of that designation is to accommodate those areas, but you then have to drill down and look at all the shorelines and where it applies. So it's policy language that then gets further refined before the
Can we
designation.
define it? I mean, we define everything else. We define low density. We don't define medium density and high density.
I could look at that if that's something that the planning commission as a whole wants me to.
Well, when you
up and
take
look
out
at.
Lambert's, which was when we all had our discussion, was a high density area, and that's what we interpreted Lambert's to be. Not the fact that some of them were identified as Lambert's in the planning, but they hadn't been developed yet. We identified Lambert's as a high density development area, which is why we looked at them for shoreline development.
Right.
But we've taken out Lambert's now totally out of the document in the SEDs, but we haven't defined medium and high density. That's why I asked, is high density considered a Lambert, which I would think it would be.
I would think that a Lambert area that is a Lambert that is fully built out and has a lot of development very close to the shoreline, we'd consider that high density. But just because it's a Lambert, and even just because even if it has every parcel developed, if there's still a shoreline function, that doesn't necessarily mean that area should be zoned or should be designated shoreline residential.
Well, I think
And
we've done
that
that
wouldn't
in
solve
our
that issue.
conversations. We've identified those places
Yeah.
as separate from urban conservancy, rural conservancy, et cetera. But I think when you take out a whole section, a specific defined word, Lambert's, and you take it out of the document, I think when you put in medium and high density, you need to define in the definitions what medium and high density means. And Lambert's is a high density area because that's how we interpreted the shoreline residential SEDs.
So potentially we could add something like such as Lambert's or something like that to
Yeah.
reflect the fact that those are areas that are more dense.
Right.
I could do something like that.
I think one thing that we should consider too is that if shoreline residential is not, that SED is not just for developed areas, but areas that are planned to be developed. And a LAMRID by definition is a planning tool for more intense development. So I think that taking LAMRIDs out of shoreline residential is a mistake because it either is or it's planned to be, and that's why the LAMRID even exists.
Okay, I can look at that a little closer. Sure.
And the other thing, when you talk about UGAs, we had a lot of discussion when we were talking about SEDs about what is and is not in the UGA. And one of the ones that brings really close to my memory was the one in Long Lake, where it was inside a UGA, but we identified it as rural. And it wasn't. It was actually inside a UGA, so it was urban conservancy instead of rural conservancy.
Those got fixed.
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah. So when I look at, we take out UGAs and we take out Lambert's and we redefine them as medium and high density. I think there just needs to be some clarification.
Yeah, no, I think that when the SED calculations are being made, there's a list of criteria for each SED, and virtually no parcel meets one perfectly without having a little bit of overlap on the others. So just including Lamrid in shoreline residential, even if it wasn't developed yet, or it was mistakenly given a Lamrid when it's not really ever going to be developed, that doesn't mean it's automatically going to be shoreline residential in future designations. But I think it's one of the things that should be considered in there. I mean, if we designated a reach a Lamrid, we should at least consider it as a shoreline residential SED. Doug, did that answer?
It does.
Did that address your issue? Okay, was that the only thing in 200 you had?
That's right.
Does anybody else have any quick things? We want to move forward into what we're supposed to be doing tonight, but if there's anything that is glaring, I don't want to miss it. So we're going to start off with 400 then?
Yes, just 1 second to take a
Okay.
note and then I'll get right there.
Just to back up a second to Andy, when you say that ecology wanted to have it a little bit more the same, that's not, it has to be, they would prefer it,
It
right?
needs to be, they need to be
Be pretty-
consistent. So at a minimum, our SMP must have a designation system that is consistent with the WACs. Obviously, the easiest way to do that is to use theirs. But if we have local circumstances that dictate we change it or do some sort of clarification, we can certainly do so. We just need to make sure that at the end of the day, it's consistent with
Okay.
ecology's guidelines.
Okay, so we'll move on to 400.
So before we do,
Okay.
I'm just reading this. Do we need something that says residential? Because that's urban conservancy.
This is urban
right?
conservative. Yes, correct.
So, but I would think, because we have municipalities, urban growth areas, commercial or industrial areas of more intense development. So that does not include Lamberts.
It's shorelines within urban growth areas, so it certainly could include.
Lambert can be outside too, though. Yeah.
Right. And that would potentially, if I add that back into shoreline residential, it could be up there, but are you saying potentially would maybe the same issue could be, or the same solution could be applied in both and just say
Yeah, I think we just need something.
tied to density?
Because at least the shoreline residential says medium and high density.
Mhm.
And, we, as Mary pointed out, we identify what low density is.
Mhm.
So obviously, everything else is medium or high, right? Here, I think we leave it out currently because we talk about urban growth areas, which Lammerd would be outside of an urban growth area. So, yeah. I mean, I think you can just do commercial, industrial, or residential areas of more intense development.
Okay.
And that you aren't saying Lambert, but kind of almost saying Lambert.
Okay. I can look at that. That could be a pretty simple. Okay, go ahead and,
I feel like I kind of have to ponder that a bit, but well, I don't know. I don't want to hold things up for that.
I mean, either,
Something about that doesn't.
again, and remember, these are descriptions of, it's kind of going back in time, because we're going back to when all the work to designate these shorelines was done back in 2013, and this needs to be consistent with the work that was done then, because really the work has been done. This is kind of describing or showing the work. So, but yeah, I can look at that.
okay, let's go to 400 then. We can revisit if we need to.
Yeah.
All right, so and maybe not page by page, but I think section by section might be the best way to tackle this. So does anyone have questions or comments in section 19-400-100 existing developments?
I just have a real quick.
Go ahead.
Quick one. It's just based on reading, trying to go through all those millions of comments that we've had. And I noticed that there were some comments that were about sort of saying that non-conforming uses should really be considered conforming uses or structures. And it just got me thinking, I think this is just a general observation. I think that this SMP, if it were being written now, might be a little different because there's a lot of emphasis on structures and not so much on uses. And if that's still a bit of a problem, I think helping to clarify that you can have a non-conforming structure but have a conforming use within that structure might help to address that concern a little bit. Yeah, it's just because I noticed that comment had been made a few times.
I mean, this start of this chapter 9400 is intended to address both,
Yeah,
conforming, non-conforming, whatever we're calling them, uses and structures. And if it doesn't operationalize that, if you're trying to think through this language, if you had a non-conforming use and it doesn't allow us to do that, that is certainly something we should look at.
yeah,
But I think you're right. I mean, the focus and a lot of the conversation, a lot of the comments has been on structures.
right. And I think that particular concern, they were concerned about being, that it being acknowledged that they can be using the structure, even though it's a non-conforming structure, that there's a difference between use and structure. So they can be there and that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, and for the record and for posterity, all references to the word non-conforming have been taken out and replaced with conforming. And I did the best I could with a word scrub to make those changes and to do some verbal gymnastics to understand what we are talking about. And then there's a definition that kind of points to that. And so hopefully that is gonna work, but we'll see. A lot more eyes that are gonna be on it, so we'll find out if there's a problem. All right, does anyone have comments in 400, 100? We'll move on to 19,400, 105, proposed development. There. 19,400, 110, mitigation.
Just, yeah, that's good.
Wait.
Okay, sure.
Got 32 minutes.
A moment and then I'll.
What's your earliest that you have, Commissioner Wheatley?
Oh, well,
What's your
I'm
earliest?
just studying.
I gave mine last,
Do you have anything else in
I
400?
don't have any additional.
You might want to, for the record, state them again. I don't know that I captured that adequately last time because everyone kind of stopped at 300. So if you-
Yeah, okay, I'm,
okay.
I can do that. I have more.
Okay, great.
The earliest is,
And maybe I did, but just
Oh,
Commissioner Wheatley, what's your earliest?
my earliest is 115.
Okay,
It's pretty
okay,
minor.
115.
all right, well, we will go there.
Anybody else have anything? Yeah, and it's just, I noticed, and it goes to another section that I can't call off the top of my head, but there's this language about stream flow in A2H on page 57 of our copy. And it just, this is a note I was going to make later, and it was based on comments by, I forget who the comments were from, but it has to do with definitions, a flow of greater than 20 cubic feet per second. I think somebody in some comment called out the fact that it's not greater than, it's equal to or greater than.
I can look at that because,
that's in another place too.
That's directly from DOE though, isn't it?
well, but is it 20 or greater than 20? They're kind of, it does make a difference. So yeah, that's a small word change, but makes a
Yeah, it could be.
difference. So, okay,
Yeah.
great. Happy to look at that. anything else?
Oh, yeah, it was actually in the next one, critical freshwater habitats.
Yeah.
That issue came up, lakes 20 acres or larger,
Mhm.
and then streams and rivers of 20 cubic feet per second or more.
And that's kind of a global, I think that's a global comment throughout, so I can make sure that we get that correct. So. Anything else in 115, critical areas?
Just a comment, not so much a question as a comment. Oh, yeah, it was future ones that brought that up. The geologically hazardous areas, I noticed that there were a number of comments about geologically hazardous areas and I don't know if that includes, yeah, and frequently flooded areas. These are two areas where, again, I think if we were writing this, starting today, we'd be spending a lot more time on them because of climate change. And I think that's worth noting because as a planning commission, we have the luxury of talking about what we expect future expectations to be. And I can imagine that as we go through the comprehensive planning revision process, and as people talk about critical areas, we're going to hear a lot about introducing new criteria and changing criteria. And I think that the flooding and the geologically hazardous areas portions are going to be possibly subject to a lot more scrutiny and a lot of recommendations in the future. And so it's worth keeping that in mind now.
Yeah, and so specifically for critical areas, this SMP is taking the existing regulations and actualizing them through the SMP. It's not promulgating any changes. However, yeah, there may be future, I think it's coming, future guidance from ecology on future versions of these updates or the next periodic update. Perhaps there's going to be a climate change element. It is not mandatory, and this specific update further back in the process did not take that piece up. So that potentially could be something that the Planning Commission suggests to the board to look at, but right now the draft does not really in a comprehensive way address climate change specifically.
They aren't going to
Well,
want us to delay for 2 years to go back and look at that either.
No,
Right,
not right
well-
now.
I'm just to say it's outside the scope of how this draft was developed, but
Right.
And we'll-
your point's
However,
not
yeah, so that
lost.
raises an interesting question about our process here, because I would like to make a note of that so that when we do our report going forward, we say something about that, that these in particular, 19, 400, 115 geologically hazardous areas and frequently flooded areas, that we expect that there's going to be some change to that. And, I don't know how we word that, but it just seems like something worth noting in our report as this goes forward. That climate, these are areas where climate change is really going to make a difference.
But I think we've had some of these discussions a long time ago. And what this isn't us doing anything about critical areas. This is us saying critical areas ordinance applies here. So I think that that's kind of going outside of the scope of what we're doing. I'm not saying that we should do it at some point, but I think for us to doing shoreline stuff, we need to change the critical areas in the future too. I think everybody knows we need to, and we're gonna have to at some point.
And our specific project right now is public hearing till today, not pre-public hearing type stuff. So I don't want to get too deep into the woods. I think that, especially when I think the climate change discussions are really going to kick into high gear once we start doing comp plan stuff in the next couple of years. And that will be, everything will roll downhill from there, right from comp plan to critical areas to SMP. And hopefully we stay on this 8-year update cycle. That would be awesome if we were able to stay on this 8-year update cycle. So let's move this conversation forward to our next item then.
I just backing up with stuff. I
Sure.
don't think it's a bad thing to just put even a 1-line sentence, you know.
I think that we
mentions
certainly
that.
could do that.
It
That
mentions that this is something that we.
this SMP is not, has not taken into
Right.
account current concerns.
Just
of
so it's
climate
kind of
change.
on the record from us. that
Yeah.
we're-
Because this update is
Yeah.
decades old now, so it doesn't reflect the most current.
And so in keeping track of potentially what the planning commission's recommendation letter might be, I know that the planning commission had been interested in putting forth a message about how the board might address stormwater issues in the future, and perhaps there could be something similar to that, and, you know, be cognizant of climate change and how that shapes our need to do what we can do from a government perspective to adapt and mitigate and all those things. So,
Including all that in our
Okay.
recommendation.
Yep.
Fantastic.
Stormwater channel deal.
Yeah, and I just really like to emphasize, I mean, it'd be helpful for me at least, if this discussion right now could just get into the minutes for the next meeting.
And I think if we want to keep it to the kind of the scope of what we're looking at right now, I think it would probably be best kind of attached to 115.2 or A2A, where it talks about the currently adopted critical areas standards. And just making a note that, or actually it's just A2, making a note that those don't include new recommendations for the upcoming Department of Commerce climate guidance.
Fair, that's fair, yeah.
That way it keeps it to the strikes and additions.
I think, well, and the whole, if you zoom out, I mean, the whole document is the same thing, It doesn't take that guidance into account, so that's another option to look at policy or something like that in the preceding chapters of the document. But again, that's something the board could choose to take up if they wanted to. So, okay, is there anything else in 19,400, 115?
I had 19,400, 120. A bunch of cross outs, I guess. B5. And it's just the 15-foot building setback we talked about before, and that 97% of the shoreline residential area has already been developed. And basically you're adding another 15 feet to it's just grass in the front yard.
So I'll move to 120 if no one else has anything in 115. Give me that code citation one more time. Oh, I see. I know where I am.
It's number 5, right?
5, yes.
I thought that we had already,
We talked about it.
pre-public hearing had talked that we did not want it, because it was mainly gonna be like it was envisioned as like a construction setback.
So, hang on a sec.
But while you're looking, could I disagree?
Yeah, go ahead and say your.
Because again, and I'm remembering from comments that I read, an observation that setbacks continue to be useful because even after construction, you still have issues like maintenance, where you may need to go back into the area. So it's not really accurate to say that they cease serving a function at that point, if you think about it in terms of its environmental protection.
I know that when we had our pre-public hearing deliberations on this particular issue, we were taking into account the temporal effects of construction and maintenance. And at that time, we decided that if we maintained, or if we had this 15-foot buffer, it would effectively act as a setback, and our 50-foot setback would turn into a 65-foot setback, and that was not acceptable to the planning commission at the time. And so to not do it because it was only a temporal effect, and we already do temporal effects and mitigate for those in other areas.
So I think here in this specific case, that issue, yeah, the planning commission did discuss that and settled on the language that is here prior to publishing this version. So it doesn't look like it changed because I think I had made the planning commission at the time's recommendation then. And I think it's in this sentence here. The second sentence here is what got changed. So Oh, that doesn't, okay. Right now it says this, the building setback may be reduced or waived by the approval authority, provided that the resulting setback is protective of existing vegetation within the buffer. So if the applicant can demonstrate that whatever setback they're proposing is going to work, or that they don't need a setback based on their construction methods or what they're doing, then it can be waived. And that language there is, that was modified shortly
okay.
before the
Yeah,
public
that's
hearing.
good.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure. I'm not crazy. We did change
Well,
that.
I mean, because I wasn't here at the time,
Mhm.
but I know that ecology made comments on this and said that the buffer is important. So I don't know if we want to go back and revisit that, but
No.
I at least want to register that there's some diversity of opinion on this matter.
That would be an excellent point to put in a secondary report if it is the minority opinion.
And I would also
I have
add,
a comment.
it's helpful to keep in mind that ecology is tracking this process. They've received this draft and I'm in regular communication with their staff. Once the planning commission issues its recommendation, we are then at that time asking them to officially take a look at that piece and give us their take on that.
Mhm.
So I think there's more guidance to come from them. And then obviously the whole package gets reviewed and approved by them before it takes effect. So there's definitely still more opportunities for them to weigh in on that.
Well,
And
I
I'm-
do remember they weighed in on this and said buffer is important.
Right.
So,
Yeah, and
I have a comment.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Commissioner.
I agree. I support Commissioner Wheatley's concerns about this. I feel like there was a large number of public comments that outweighed the ones that were requesting increased buffers or maximum buffers seem to by number, fairly largely outweigh those that wanted reduced buffers. And yet this document is filled with reductions in buffers. And it just doesn't add up to me that we're taking in the input of the public on this.
Go ahead, Commissioner Wheatley.
Well, another element of that is, it seems to me, I mean, my feeling about this whole section is, this is where it would be really helpful to have some reference to best available science, where we're looking at the sources by which the decision was made to actually reduce the buffer. I think under the WACs on best available science, there's supposed to be some explanation.
Well, again, we're only going to be doing from public hearing forward. These issues were litigated before. If there's disagreement, we're not unanimous on our recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners. That's the perfect thing to put into a minority report and turn in so all views are being heard. But we're not going to go start over on this process that's already been multiple years in the going. So
Yeah, but I'm just making my,
yeah,
making my statement.
yeah.
okay. Does anyone else have anything on I think section 19-400-120?
Oh, I have one other thing. I've been reading a lot.
That's good. That's good.
I was reading Fish and Wildlife, best available science guidelines, and they would like to have riparian buffers specifically called out as well. And again, given the age of the document, that doesn't happen, but it might be worth thinking about. And
I don't, what do you mean called out?
they would, well, I mean, I don't know that they were talking about SMPs so much as just, well, they may have been talking more about critical areas, but they would like, you know, just as there's interest in adding climate change as an element,
Yeah.
They would like to see riparian buffers treated specifically, you know, not just kind of rolled into what you do for wetlands and so forth, but that riparian buffers kind of have their own dynamics. And so, yeah, I'm just making note of that.
Yeah, and they are, so this section, the 19-400-120, it contains the buffers for streams and also for marine riparian areas, which they're marine riparian, technically that's a critical area, but under shorelines, they're no longer critical areas, they are shorelines. So all the protections for those, the buffers are in this section. And then for those streams that are not shoreline streams, therefore they're under 20 cubic feet per second, but they're in shoreline jurisdiction, say they flow out in the Puget Sound, all the protections for those would be contained in 19-400-115 and then Appendix E. So all the critical area language that specifically addresses freshwater riparian within shoreline jurisdiction, all that is being carried forward. Okay, how about 19-400-125? Water quality and quantity, that's a pretty short one.
I had a comment last time on that, which was something in there about adhering to our SH 21.6 and SH 21.7, which addresses stormwater. We're talking about water quality. We need to be concerned about what we're dumping into the water.
Yeah, I think
The
that
appropriate place to make a reference to.
when we make that,
I can't remember what you told us.
I think what I said was it's at the Planning Commission's discretion to refer back to the policies in the document if they think it underscores the point, but that, you know, those policies all apply. It's all going forward as one package. So if you want to do that for emphasis, you can, it's your discretion. And I don't know that there was a clear direction that I recorded on that.
I think when you articulate our desire to have more references to the future impacts of climate change and stormwater, we can incorporate all that together in the same thing. And while this document is not comprehensive to climate change and stormwater, if you got it in, go ahead.
Oh, I just had one question about that. So this is specific to new development. It doesn't include redevelopment?
Well, redevelopment would be considered new development. Yeah, it doesn't apply retroactively to existing development, but if you're changing your footprint or something like that, or you're adding new development, it would apply.
In stormwater vernacular, there's a distinction.
Okay.
So it might be worth adding.
Okay. Where would you see fit to?
It would just say new and redevelopment.
Okay, I can certainly look at that. And I did, Commissioner Carmen, I did not record any decisions related to echoing the policies at the last meeting. I just checked my notes, so I'm not sure if there's a.
Well, I think that what I recall now, since you mentioned it, is that the policies do carry through the whole document, but because of concern for climate change and whatnot, and we are talking about water quality, a reference to those policies here would be good, as well as in the whatever cover document we send with the.
So in the cover, okay, great.
Because I can certainly tell you, climate change is impacting a lot of things, as we all saw in Yellowstone.
All right, moving on, section 130. Historic, archaeological, cultural, scientific, and educational resources, which now has the correct acronym. And nothing there than 135. Or maybe we don't have a 135 actually. Look at that. 140 bulk conventional standards.
So 140 is going to become 135.
It's not. It's gonna stay. Nope. It's gonna stay. All right.
That's a ripple effect.
Yeah. Okay. So 145 public access. This got reorganized, but I don't think a lot of the language changed. Things moved to a different section. Anything on public access?
Well, the only thing that you asked me to bring it up again was the word regulations under A1. Except as provided in regulations 1, 4, 5, and 6 below is actually paragraphs 4, 5, and 6 below.
I think that one I captured, I'm pretty sure. Check.
that we're referencing the paragraphs below, not specific regulations.
Yeah, and that's, I think I did make note of that, because that is gonna be a global thing that I'll have to work
Yeah.
through, because yeah, you know, section, subsection, paragraph, clause, sentence.
Yeah.
Each time you indent it, you call it something different, and just that's kind of one of the last minute formatting scrub things we do, is to make sure those words are used appropriately. So,
Anything else in public access?
not, I think, 150.
I'm
Just
trying to
Commissioner, sorry,
understand. Yeah, again, this is something from reading the ecology comments. And I'm just gonna throw this out as a question more. It seemed like with 6 and 7 or 7 under public access, as I understood ecology's comments, they were concerned about mitigation, or that they wanted it clear that if there were going to be public access provided somewhere else, that it was somewhere in the vicinity of where the public access was denied, because the way that the language was at the time, it could have been other property that the person owned in a whole other place. And it was a bit ambiguous that it was supposed to be somewhere in the vicinity.
Close, yeah.
And I don't know if that got fixed or noted.
It states a preference for
Does it?
water body, watershed.
Yeah.
It does, okay. Yeah, I wasn't able to quite understand it well, so thank you. So I wasn't sure if that got addressed or not.
Yeah, it's trying to be close, as close to the impacted areas.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that's
Right.
good then.
Yeah. Okay.
I just had one question. Like, I'm assuming that there's like no intended like change from removing some of the recreational from recreational and public.
Right.
It's probably just redundant.
The previous draft kind of blended recreational. So recreational development is a type of development, and public access is one requirement that we have to plan for under the SMA. And those things kind of got blended together. You know, you might develop, someone might want to do recreational development outside of the requirements to provide public access, for example, and we want to make sure those things are clear.
Okay.
This language is intended to address when shoreline development requires public access per the SMA. But you know, if you're building playground and benches and things like that, it's recreational development, and those other standards are also going to apply, but they're two different concepts. And so this draft is an attempt to decouple those, and I'm eager to learn how well I did when ecology weighs in.
Thanks, that's perfect.
Okay, there's nothing else in public access. So 150 is the flood hazard reduction measures. And I think that might be our last section or close to it in this chapter. Anyone have anything on 150?
Yeah, and again, it's probably more a question. Just because I haven't sat with this. But again, I noticed in the comments, and I had to take them particularly seriously because they're conservation district employee comments, about shoreline armoring. And is this inadvertently, there was concern that as the language was written, that it might inadvertently be suggesting or opening the door to armoring in order to, or that it wasn't maybe restrictive enough to make it clear that armoring is not a preferred form of
So
hazard reduction.
Chapter 19-600 also addresses shoreline stabilization, which includes armoring among other things. So development is going to have to adhere to that language as well, which is very prescriptive as to when and how you would do shoreline stabilization and armoring. This specific piece here is intended to address one of the requirements of the SMA, which is that SMPs address flood hazard reduction. But I think you still would have to have one of the use cases that triggers a new bulkhead or something like that to be able to get that. Yeah, so, and we'll get there in 19-600 and we'll be looking at that, but yeah, you have to check certain boxes before that would be allowed. even if, regardless of what this says, it's the most restrictive applies, is my understanding. If anyone else has anything there, otherwise,
Well, I think we got less than 5 minutes left with you, and so this might be a good place to actually break on SMP and move on to our next item for this evening, because I don't think we're going to get through 500 in less than 5 minutes.
I don't think so either, but if anyone does have comments on 155, that is the last section in this chapter. Does anyone have anything on restoration and enhancement?
I'm just kind of curious, what you say you're working with ecology. I'm kind of wondering, are they saying anything about where they are as far as their review right now, or are we on track, I guess?
Informally, well, on the things I have asked for and asked them about and included in here as proposed changes, I would say yes. I think there are some items that are going forward that might be more of a hard sell that have been baked into this document, but you know, since I took over the project, I've been doing the best I can to make sure that everything that's going forward is as close to acceptable as it can be, because ultimately, why put something forward if we know that they're not going to accept it? But I've had a good amount of buy-in on, you know, the changes that were proposed since the public hearing in a lot of areas. So yeah, and we'll be in regular communication, and also I don't know everything they're thinking at any time. Like I said, I am eager to get, you know, wholesale comments on this next version of the draft, because I think that's when we'll really know where we stand. But I can say we're not going to get there tonight, but for example, I have some proposed amendments to the agriculture language that we'll talk about in 600 that I know for a fact what's proposed, since the public hearing has buy-in from ecology, and we'll just see how that looks once it leaves planning commission. So that's definitely more coming.
Anybody have anything on 155?
Sherry. Bob, thank you very much.
So next time we're together, we're going to do 500 for sure, and you'll be ready for 600 too if we have stuff.
Yeah.
Yep.
Keep moving.
I can't imagine we'll get through 5 and 600 and then have extra time left over next week. So
And I'm open to suggestions on the format. Like I said, I don't want to go page by page, but I feel like the section by section might be the best way to do it, unless someone's got a different idea.
no, I think that's the right way to do it. So thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you.
All right, with that, we're going to move on to the next agenda item, number 5, which is a work session on the wireless code update with our planner, Caitlin Nelson.
Commissioner Casino, Commissioner Hanson has a question.
Oh, Commissioner Hanson, do you have something? Commissioner Hanson, do you have a comment you wanted to put forward?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to let you know that I am going to have to step away during this agenda item. My wife's flight was delayed, and so I'm home alone. I'm going to have to leave at some point here to put my son to bed. I'll come back once he's asleep, though.
Thank you very much. All right, thank you.
Dual task,
Let the record show.
The record shows somebody's tired.
I forgot my glasses today.
Help drive.
All right, good evening, planning commissioners. My name is Caitlin Nelson. We were given about 45 minutes for this, and we've got a bit to get through. And we also have our wireless consultants, Ken Feldman and Colleen McCroskey on Zoom. This code update had a public hearing held with the planning commission in the summer of 2021, and then a stakeholder committee was put together and had 3 meetings during this last winter, which included community members and representatives of the wireless providers, and many of the concerns discussed at those meetings were also provided in a memo from the community members. The county is limited in what we can legally address, so we have not gone through that in detail. Don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to read that. But we had previously been discussing priority areas for citing. And Pierce County Code's table was used as an example, and that's what I have here. While doing something like this is possible, it would be more lenient. Because what this does is it allows more uses like towers to be administrative permits if they do things like camouflage, whereas our draft requires that they do this, and it also requires a hearing examiner. So this is something that we could do theoretically, or if it's just the format that you're interested in, we could just format ours like that. But the other option is that we could include some language for prioritizing locations. This would require an applicant provide reasoning behind why a WCF needs to be cited in a lower priority area. Remember that the county cannot require that there be a gap in service, and note that the details of what needs to be identified are not outlined here because it would change from site to site. And the county attorneys can be involved in the review process. So some of those specifics can be in internal documents. This prioritizes in the order of industrial, commercial, open space, and then residential, kind of what we had talked about before, a little bit more general. This is just a list. You don't have to digest these zones. This is just which ones would likely be categorized that way. And so these zones could look like this if that's the language and the direction that the Planning Commission would like to go. So what are your thoughts on priority areas? Is there one or the other that you would like to look into?
I really like this, but I'd like to hear Commissioner Pestinger's thoughts on this especially.
Well, unfortunately, I can't see it, and it wasn't mailed out as part of the meeting packets.
Okay. Well, it is essentially, as I described, it is just language that states when an applicant applies for a permit, they need to state their reasoning for why they would not be able to cite it in an area that would be a higher priority. The exact zones are not so much important, but we would be looking at including language in the next draft that you receive that identifies that the priority areas would be industrial, commercial over open space and residential.
Commissioner Simmons, did you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I'm a little, when I'm looking at the list of the open space, the McAllister geological sensitive area, that for some reason, I just feel that that's shouldn't be there or down further on the list somehow. And it just seems like that's a pretty sensitive watershed too.
Well, I think what they're asking for is the format on how we make these priorities and make this prioritization list. That's really the question, isn't it?
Yeah, but included in that could be, is this the general order that you would like to see? Would you like it to be that you would prioritize industrial and commercial, and that residential and open space environmental would be the same as far as the lower
Go ahead,
priority?
Commissioner Day.
So I think along those lines, like when I look at the open space, like having each of those treated equally doesn't seem quite appropriate.
That's right.
So like the McAllister geological sensitive area versus like long-term forestry.
Right.
Like long-term forestry is the kind of place you could probably camouflage it. You could, it's probably privately owned, or it's
Do you think you'd want to prioritize each of these areas instead of having big, broad, general categories?
Or prioritize those categories underneath that category, like 1A, B, C, D.
I think you could have a, personally, I like tables.
Yeah, I was gonna ask if we
You
could.
could, you could have kind of categorical priorities, and then like within like open space, I think is probably right where I would do it, is have those listed out separately line by line. So like right now in residential, for me, those seem like it's okay to treat those equally. So you could have those in like one box in your table.
On the residential, I think the higher the density, though.
Well, then maybe that's
Yeah. If we're gonna have hierarchies within categories, the higher the density, the lower the priority.
That's pretty much what she's done.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that you know, the industrial, commercial, open space, residential. I think that order is fine, but it almost seems like, is there, and I don't know how you exclude some of the more sensitive places, but can you make another one that this is like the last place that we want to have, if that makes sense?
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
That could be a lowest priority category. Pick out the things that we think are most important to protect.
Yeah, it seems like the residential could sort of be unpacked a bit. I mean, in terms of, when I'm thinking about 5G and that perennial issue I bring up of people not wanting to have a box right outside their second floor, window, that doesn't really get to that.
Well, we have language for that elsewhere, don't we? That they're not going to be able to put a 5G box right smack dab next to somebody's window just because they happen to live on a arterial highway.
Well, we talked about that too, and it was like they could be within, I think it was 20 feet.
No, I'll go over setbacks as
Okay.
well today.
But we do have
But
setbacks.
for residential areas, it's generally 100% of a tower height. But that we don't address right of ways. But that's essentially, street lamps, it would go there.
Commissioner Day, did you want to look at her table example before okay, can you show us
Yeah, I just kind of
the?
went by fast.
Well, I can,
Just briefly toggle back.
how do I toggle back? Why isn't it working? Yeah, I can definitely format it this way.
I think maybe just priority versus the review. I just like to.
Yeah, really. I mean, that's slightly different, isn't it? I mean, that's not about priorities.
Yeah, this is under what circumstances, which permit would be required. So it's a little bit different, but I don't think it's unreasonable to put some of those requirements in a table format anyways.
Yeah.
But this could also be done for things like zones.
I think it's worded differently, but it really is. Because what you're gonna do is, if you want to build a tower, you're gonna want to go here. You don't want to go to a conditional use permit. So it's going to, not by saying, this is our priority, but just by saying, we're gonna make it easier if you do this. It's a little bit harder, and here's your conditional use permit, that's.
Well, okay, so just to clarify, with the language that I have up for prioritizing based on which zone, that doesn't change whether or not it's administrative or a conditional use permit. This example does, and if we wanted, having it in a table format is fine. If we wanted to prioritize based on administrative or conditional use permits, that would require being more lenient for certain types of uses. Whereas, in this example, certain towers would be allowed to be administrative in certain areas if they camouflage it or design it a certain way. We are requiring that they always be designed or to a hearing examiner. So whether or not we prioritize based on permit types is different. I can put it in this format either way, but what I'm hearing is just that you just want to see it this way, not that you want to prioritize based on permit types, correct?
So
Go ahead.
I think Commissioner Nelson makes a really interesting point. If the goal is to, have this highest priority, are we creating the easiest pathway for people is into those areas so that it just looks like a headache to do the other ones? If we're able to do that, I think we might be more likely to achieve the goals of keeping these facilities in the places we want them.
Possibly. I would guess that the counter to that is that if somebody like AT&T comes through and they see that it's one more day's worth of headache for them and $3,000 worth of more fees, they don't care. They'll jump through it. They'll still do it. So, like a building permit for somebody would impact the cost or time for a building permit would impact somebody like me. But would it impact somebody like a major wireless carrier? They might not care. It's just another brick in their wall. So I don't know. I like the idea of prioritizing by land type or zone. And then after that, also prioritizing by, well, then you have your permitting scheme on top of that to work through things.
Can you overlay the type of permit with the zoning?
I think the two
Yeah,
get
I
separated
mean,
somewhere.
like one example could be if you wanted to make something that would normally be a hearing examiner approval, an administrative special use permit if it was in these commercial industrial zones and they met all these requirements. That's one way that you could overlap that.
I think that's where I think the incentive might be useful. Like it
Yeah.
might not make a difference, but it's what we're trying to do anyway. It's what it, you know.
I think hybridizing this one with the other one. I like the one that you showed up there with the industrial, commercial, open space and residential. But like everybody said, there's some of those on open space that really should fall at the bottom of the list, even below residential. As ones that we really don't want to see these things at. I think everybody would agree with that.
I mean, I would probably put it all into a table where it started with our priorities. Then
Yeah.
it went to the level of review and then it had requirements for each one.
Well, and I think in Thurston County, I think the zoning is probably a better route. Because if we say, well, you can be permitted in industrial areas, you gotta have a conditional use permit in residential areas. Thurston County doesn't have a lot of industrial areas outside of the cities. So you're going to automatically have this extra step that you have to go through to get to your permit. Whereas, I mean, you go from Tumwater to Tenino, there's one little commercial area. Everything else is residential or long-term ag, like down to Old 99. That's, I mean, probably within, at least within a quarter mile of Old 99, everything is residential. So do we want to just automatic? I mean, that's, I was pointing out that this is a different, is a way to say, you know, these areas are preferred areas, these are not preferred areas. But I think saying that, I just think that we've got the permit process and we've spent a lot of time going through that. And it's probably not right yet, it probably still needs some tweaking, but I think that's a better fit for us because of, just because I think we have challenges of, I mean, even if you go down I-5, there's the area at Maytown that's industrial. There's Grand Mound. And then you got to get to Lewis County before you find the next industrial area. So.
Well, I guess the question is, which direction should we like her to work towards?
If it's a combination of both, I can draft that.
Can you do that?
Yeah.
Would that be fine for everybody? Commissioner Pessinger, did you have any more thoughts on this?
Thank you to Andrew for forwarding me the PowerPoint. It looks good.
All right, thank you.
So I had something else. But I'll figure it out later.
Is there a time limit on approval? It seems to me I have in my head from discussions before that,
The shot clock?
yeah, you had to, things had to be done in a certain time period or we're in trouble or they get to have their way anyway.
Yes, and that's generally how we have it categorized at the moment, where like for a co-location permit, I'm not recalling how many days it is, but the way that our hearing examiner process works, that turnaround would be much quicker than how long our process for a hearing examiner normally works. But if we were to do the opposite and say the turnaround, the shot clock is long enough that it could go to a hearing examiner, but we want it to be shorter, we want to make it administrative, that's totally fine. But generally towers would go to a hearing examiner. Co-locations would not be able to because of how quickly we have to turn around.
So
Yeah,
we're
no,
not
that's fair.
gonna get ourselves in trouble by adding more restrictions that adds time.
Okay.
So I just remembered what I was thinking. When we're talking about these areas, might make sense to go back and look at critical areas because McAllister has its own set of critical areas regulations. So it may be open spaces here and McAllister may just not be feasible anyways. So it wouldn't make sense to make a whole nother section. Whereas if we just said open space. But I don't know exactly, I don't think we thought about cell towers when we were talking about McAllister, but there are some hurdles to building in McAllister area.
Yeah, and these are technically all zones that are in the permit table as allowed. The draft that you haven't seen does have language in it that is from the existing code actually that prohibits wireless facilities in critical areas and wetlands, which I think just got left out because it was assumed that that wouldn't be allowed, but apparently that's not the case. So even if that is an allowed zone, it wouldn't be allowed in those specific, like you mentioned, areas that would be preventative to build in.
So in that table, you would say prohibited.
There will be language saying that they're prohibited in critical areas and wetlands. But for now, it sounds like I'll take a look at that and we might still end up putting that as the lowest priority. Yeah, okay.
Even in the open space category, do you have to list them? I mean, can it
No,
be just left open and let the applicant say this is where we want to go and then either go yay or nay to that, or is that too much of a?
Either that or it could be an internal policy discussion where it's determined by staff what is considered open space. I wasn't necessarily suggesting that this be listed out in the draft code, but it sounds like that is something that you're interested in as a group. So I would add that, but
I like
it's
the
not
idea of
required.
listing them by zones, because that's what's already in the codes. That's what the planners and the permit department already know and look at. So if you build a chart that has those two things, the type of permit that you go down through and the type of zone, with even identifying what may be prohibited based on critical areas ordinance, I think that's a win-win.
Commissioner Wheelie?
Just a question. Besides the permits, what else would sort of would activate this priority area concept? Like, would they, if they propose to build in a lower priority area, what does that mean in a practical sense? Do they have to explain why they can't build in a higher priority area?
Yes, that is the intention of the language. And it is left a little general just because the reasons for why they wouldn't be able to build in a specific area could vary pretty widely. And it would make more sense for that to be reviewed by our county attorneys to make that determination.
And maybe they don't exist. I was just looking at that, thinking that, only 3 and 4 exist for them to add more, depending on how they have to concentrate the towers in the commercial and industrial areas. Lacey and, where all the business and everything is. I don't know how many more towers they need in those areas. They need to build towers out in the country, and which is 3 and 4.
I mean, they would be doing equipment upgrades and new infrastructure that would be caught by a lot of this language though. So I think that
It's still valid. It's just, I'm saying, majority of the new towers are going to be in 3 and 4. I would think.
All right, well, if you can put together that hybrid for us to take a look at, maybe we should individually think about how we would want each of these subcategories to be prioritized. We can have that discussion. That would be a good thing.
Just could we get a copy of this? Would you send us a copy of this?
I just have a curiosity question. Like, when you say the military reservation, what type of control do we have over that?
That's a good question. What I would think would happen is that they would need approval as landowners from the military reservation. And then they would also get a permit through us. So nothing would happen unless the property owners agreed to it. Is that what you're asking?
Which is the government.
Yeah.
Or
JBLM would need to approve any of that on their property, so they have to go through Army and DOD and then come to us.
Now, if the Army comes and says, we want this tower here, what's the
So if it's
county gonna
on-
say?
If it's on federal land,
Mhm.
the county has no jurisdiction. So, but if it's within the military reservation, not on federal land, we would review it as the code says we need to.
Well, I'd almost put that higher up. GBLM, go for it.
It might blow it up.
I was gonna say, I wonder what machine guns do.
Well, hey.
Jim, I don't think that's a terrible idea at all.
But, you know, I mean,
Yeah.
it's got the space and I don't drive through the base.
Maybe it goes at the top of the open space list.
Mhm.
Is there a lot of zoned military reservation that is not owned by the federal government?
I don't know that off the top of my
It
head.
seems counterintuitive to me that there would be a military zone that they didn't own.
Yes, but there could be something that is not owned by the federal government.
Okay.
Well, they drive it.
I don't know. I mean,
Tribal,
National Guard?
National Guard has some, state, absolutely.
All right.
Yeah, good point.
I think I'm on the right page.
Okay.
Okay, so related to priority areas, we were also talking about allowed zones. These 3 zones were identified by the wireless provider stakeholders from the stakeholder committee meetings as zones that showed WCFs as prohibited, and they requested that that be reconsidered. So I have, and these were mentioned in the previous slide, just as examples of where they could go, but long-term forestry was most likely an error in the table as prohibited because there was language that called out spacing reduction specifically in the long-term forestry zone in the existing code. Community representatives requested this either be a lower priority location or a prohibited zone. For highway commercial, there was no objection from the community members to making that an allowed zone. And for public parks, trails, and preserves, community members requested that this either be a lower priority location or a prohibited zone. And as a note, like with the military reservation, any county-owned land still would require an agreement, so we would need to agree to any location citing. For these zones, you could either say that you would like to allow WCFs in these zones, keep them the same, leaving them prohibited, or some possible mixture of the two, like allowing attachments, but not towers or something like that. Are there any questions? Otherwise, you could say long-term, what's your thoughts?
Just a clarification, I don't know if I heard correctly, were you saying that the long-term forestry, the request was to not allow or to allow?
To allow.
To allow, yeah, because I thought I heard you say not, so. I mean, it seems, so my response would be, that seems like a good prioritization, but I agree that really my preference would be that public parks, trails and preserves, not trials, but trails and preserves would be off, you know, would be at the absolute bottom or very close to the absolute bottom of the list of priority areas. And I am a bit concerned about the concept of, in particular, attaching stuff to, say, ball field lights and things, you know, that's one of the areas that's kind of attractive, but it's also where a lot of kids are. I don't know. We need to discuss that.
Well, I think on the long-term forestry question, that there's probably pretty good consensus that it being allowable is a reasonable thing.
Yeah.
And then,
Well, and in fact, it might be, I mean, since
be
it
a
might
higher
be
priority.
worth saying that it's a value to get this out to the rural
Mhm.
community. You know, that's you know, it might be worth listing as a priority.
That actually rolls into the concern about the public parks, trails and preservations, though, that like when you're out at the Deschutes Park and way out in Yelm, there's no cell service out there. And even the county is using satellite stuff for their hydrology input. So I don't know if one of these outfits would want to put a tower out there, but you know, not making it easy for them, but not prohibiting them might not be a bad idea either. Having 911 service out at a public park is not a terrible thing.
Yeah, having family that hikes and climbs, I want them to be able to make a cell phone call that fall.
Mhm. So I don't mind public parks, trails and preserves being not the highest priority, but I would feel uncomfortable making it prohibited.
So would I, and I can give you a perfect example out of Lake Lawrence where we couldn't get cell coverage out there. We had a boat accident with hydros and the guy died. Another one coming into a boat dock late at night and have his lights on, ran into a concrete dock, flipped him over the top of the dock, his wife in the water, both almost drowned. Didn't have any cell coverage.
Mhm.
Had to go a half a mile to get a phone in the residential.
Yeah.
Okay, so is there an agreement then to at least now change the draft to allow in each of these zones, and then we will include it in the prioritization?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think my instincts would be to basically use that as the prioritization. First, start with parks. My first thought is those like ball field lights is the perfect place to put them, because it's not gonna change what people see. And then kind of in sequence into trails and preserves. I also have to say, as a frequent user of the outdoors, I've had to call 911 for the field, and really lucky we were able to.
And also like priority.
Yeah. All right.
Okay. Okay, there were some concerns about setbacks last time as well, so I wanted to go over those. The current code is fairly limited. It's 110% of the structure height with some allowance for reductions. The draft has different setbacks for residential and for non-residential. In residential, it's 100% of the tower height. And for lattice and guide towers, it is 2 feet for every foot of tower height. And I might change that to be more consistent.
I'm sorry, lattice and guide towers.
Yeah, so when we say tower, that could be pretty much any standing structure. So when you see a monopole, I wish I had a picture, but a monopole would be smaller. It would have attachments coming off of it. Lattice and guide tower are the big traditional looking towers that you think of usually. So those generally have more requirements. They go to a hearing examiner and they have bigger setbacks.
Maybe I'm just not understanding this right when it comes to the lattice and guide towers, because that's not necessarily. Are we able to change these setbacks any, or are the federal laws going to be telling us exactly what these setbacks have to be? Can we increase them or decrease them any at our discretion?
Well, these, as it is drafted, these setbacks are what is being recommended from our legal team. But Ken, if you're there, this might be a good time to kind of give some information on what the legal concerns are around changing the setbacks and what we could consider.
Sure. Thanks, Kate. To answer the first part of the question, the federal law is not going to tell us you can do setbacks of X number of feet or 2 times the height or whatever, but you can't do any more than that. All the federal law tells us is that we can't have restrictions or regulations that have the effect of prohibiting the ability to provide service. So when Kate mentioned just a minute ago that the draft currently has requirements that we have recommended, the reason for the recommendation is that we have seen setbacks like this in numerous codes throughout the country, and we've never seen them challenged. So we're really confident that they would withstand any kind of a challenge that says your setback requirements per se cause us to be unable to provide service. Once you start increasing those, in my opinion, my legal opinion is we're getting into a gray area. And, I might be able to tell you if you say 3 times that amount, that, yeah, that's almost definitely going to get overturned. But when you're in that gray area before you get to the extreme, I'm not really going to be able to tell you that this is going to win in court or this is going to lose in court. We were just asked by staff to make a recommendation that we were confident would be reasonably upheld if challenged.
Is there a maximum height?
Well, I mean, there's no maximum height for a tower. If someone applied to put a tower up, it might be a 100-foot tower, it might be, I suppose it could be a 250-foot tower. It just depends on the property and what what might be considered by those who are making the land use decisions. I guess it would be a hearing officer to be appropriate on a site-specific basis. So there's certainly nothing in the federal law that talks about a maximum tower height.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question about this concept of legal challenge. And, the gray area. It seems like, or, kind of what I'm wondering is what is the nature of that challenge? I mean, let's say that a carrier really wants to place something somewhere and they want to challenge the setback rule. Isn't it likely that, trying to think about the relative risk to the county, being challenged in that way, isn't it usually the case that all they're really going to fight for is the right to put that thing in that particular place? I mean, it's not going to be it's not likely to be a challenge to the whole setback rule, is it? It's more likely to just be an argument over placing a particular facility in a particular place.
Right. I think I agree with you. I would describe it as it would be a site-specific analysis. In this particular case, would the imposition of whatever the county requirement is cause the applicant to be unable to provide service or materially inhibit their ability to provide service? So it would be just looking at that site. And I suppose there might be an argument that if it was an extremely outrageous amount, that some court might be convinced to overturn the entire regulation. But I would think in the vast majority of cases, a court making a decision to overturn the county's position would be to say, at this site, in this particular location, this regulation cannot be imposed.
Well, I think that's worth thinking about because when you're thinking about the relative risk, of having a setback regulation, you may be willing to go into that gray area a bit if that's the most likely challenge.
And I think that with a lot of the public testimony we've heard, and specifically to residential zones, the concerns about setbacks are not so much about whether it's camouflage or not. They are health and safety concerns, not aesthetic concerns. So if we can consider larger setbacks, especially for residential zones, I think we should at least have that discussion in some form or another.
Yeah, let me just jump in there real quick on the health and safety issues. If the safety issues that you're referring to relates to if the tower falls and we don't have a sufficient setback, is it going to hurt somebody or cause property damage? That's a valid safety issue to consider. If the issue is we want it set back because we're afraid that the people who are in the surrounding area will be too close to the tower and that there will be radio frequency kinds of safety issues, that is a concern that the federal law, unfortunately, does not allow local governments to consider. If a site meets the FCC requirements with their emissions, that's all they have to demonstrate. So I would ask you to be careful in thinking about your concerns for safety. And when you articulate them, if you can try to stay away from the radio frequency kinds of safety issues and limit to the physical issues. On the physical issue, I will tell you that the industry will say that the way that towers are built these days, if they were to fall, they would not simply fall over, that they're built to kind of like buckle within into themselves and just collapse. And I have seen some videos demonstrating that, but I would also tell you that towers generally do not fall over. And at least my feeling is I have not seen a significant amount of proof that would cause me to say, I'll take their word that that's how it will always happen. So I do think it's reasonable to think about anyway, if a tower were to fall over, are we in an industrial zone? Are we adjacent to a residential zone? Does it make sense for the setback to be a little bit longer if we have more traffic in an area, pedestrian or vehicular? I think those things are valid considerations for you to think about, but I also wanted to advise you of, what the construction technology has become, which is more to have these things collapsing within themselves.
Commissioner Pestinger, did you have anything on this particular issue?
I'll just show some support for the concept of pushing the limits a little bit. This is a very one-sided direction we already have to head in order to comply with some rather strict rules from the FCC. And one thing I was taught about negotiation is if they accept your first offer, then you didn't ask for enough. And so I think we might consider, seeing how far we can push it.
Go ahead, Commissioner Day.
Just a question on the relative risk. What's the venue that a challenge to one of these setbacks might be heard in? Is that a federal court challenge? Or is that?
It could go in either federal or state court. Most of them that I've seen have gone in federal court, but there's a bunch of them that go into state court. It could go in either place.
Okay. Does it have a pathway through the land use hearings? Yeah, growth management hearings board. Sorry.
The I'm not familiar with the growth management hearings.
So I can take that one. So there once, for the record, Christina Chapeau, planning manager, there is a brief window once the Board of County Commissioners adopt the final rule. There's a 60-day appeal period on any adoption of zoning or land use regulations. And at that point in time, the industry, well, actually anyone can challenge it. And that challenge would go to the Growth Management Hearing Board. They would review it to see if it met GMA and not necessarily federal regulations. And then it would be remanded back, or an order would be issued to the county.
But no individual permit disputes would run through growth management.
Correct, no individual permit disputes. Yeah.
So if you would like to increase any of these setbacks and you all agree to that number, you can do that. We will be, providing all of this legal information to the board for their decision, but you can make that recommendation in this draft.
Is that a decision you need right now, or I think I'd like to think on this a little bit. I'm sure if you're.
Well, I guess, do you have any other questions about it, or?
I guess I'm a little torn. And parts of me would like to see more setbacks, but then if this is gonna slow the process down for Julie and Jean out there in the woods that have to go out in their back deck up the hill to get service.
I'm on board with you. I'm specifically thinking about residential zones.
Yeah.
Is what I'm thinking about.
Right, you know, so that, and that's what it seems like we're talking about as far as.
Yeah.
And again, even though the growth is moving out towards the county, I'm concerned, how do we get it out the easiest way to somebody way out there that, like Scott was talking about, you know, somebody that's not around and has to do all gyrations just to get a 911 call or something.
Well, I don't think a setback out in an area like that is really going to affect anything. Because all the parcels out there are huge. And so, you know, if you're on a 20-acre parcel and your setback's 100 feet or 200 feet, that's probably not going to matter. I don't know. I guess my concerns are about residential. I'm sorry?
I was saying 20 acres is 900 by 900.
Well, just remember, the majority of our zoning out in rural county is 1 to 5.
Okay, so
Let's come back to that after some more thought.
come back to that one.
Yeah.
Just really quick for non-residential zones, WCFs do follow the setbacks for the underlying zone for, you know, like commercial areas and industrial. Unless it's a lattice and guide tower, the traditional towers like we had talked about, then those are still the 100% tower height. So it's more things like monopoles that would be that smaller setback. And there is language in the code for reductions in setbacks, and based on a couple different criteria that they could meet, and a lot of that is just for some flexibility in how we implement the code. And maybe if that needs clarification, I'm sure Ken would be able to explain why we would want to have a code that allows for a reduction in setbacks.
Yeah.
Is that a concern for anybody?
I can see the breakpoint design technology that Ken was talking about. That's what all the tower guys say that will happen with the tower if it collapses. But that's not necessarily true, and I've seen that firsthand. When a large fir tree falls over in a windstorm against a tower constructed next to that fir tree, and it takes the whole thing down. Oh, just saying, they don't break point, like they just don't collapse inside of each other. They just don't.
Are you against the idea in general that you could have a reduction if they use breakpoint design tech? I mean, I'm under the impression that they're going to use a breakpoint design in all future construction anyways.
I would think they would.
So are you thinking that it's not worthy of giving them a reduction in setbacks?
I'm just saying, I mean, this was in a rural area, and it you know, the thing, if a tree falls in the woods and no one hears it, did the tree actually fall? Well, the tree actually fell, and so did the tower.
Caitlin, can you back up one slide so we can see what those setbacks are? So these are all, I mean, these are all pretty small setbacks to begin with. If these are 100-foot towers and they have the most a 20-foot setback, how much of a reduction are we expecting them to get from 20 feet down to like 10 feet?
Well, the traditional towers would still have the 100%
Okay.
height.
Okay, that makes sense.
And this could still just be something that you think on and bring up specific concerns at the next meeting.
Does anybody else have anything on this particular issue?
Okay, then the only other thing
I
that
have a clarifying question.
Yeah. Go ahead,
You
Tim.
calling on me?
Yes, go ahead.
So this, I'm not sure maybe where it fits in. Maybe it was on the table we were discussing, or maybe it's not allowed there. But there was talk about different types of facilities, small facilities and larger, all-encompassing, large-scale facilities. Would there be anything related to our prioritization or anything related to any of this guidance that would have to do with the size of the facility?
So would we be prioritizing based on the size of facility? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, is that something we could add into that prioritization, or is that not allowed?
I'm sure you could, but I would want to see how feasible that even is from a design perspective. Like if we're saying that we would prioritize towers under a certain height and that doesn't exist from a design standpoint, I would just want to make sure that we weren't adding additional requirements.
I guess there was a lot of talk from the public about things like cumulative effects, and it's not just one tower or one facility, but the cumulative effect of if you live in an area and you're surrounded by 5 different things, and 3 are large scale and 2 are small, and all of that. So I don't know whether it has to do with the size or the cumulative effect or any of that, but it seems like it's relevant to our prioritization.
Mr. Chairman, is it okay if I weigh in on this issue? Thank you. I think we need to be a little bit careful on these issues of not limiting our options. Almost everything that we put in this code is going to either directly or indirectly impact that prioritization, because depending upon how easy or hard and how extensive or costly the permitting process is, depending upon which kind of site you pick, will, as someone mentioned earlier in the meeting tonight, probably encourage applicants to try to think of what's the path of least resistance. And I've seen that happen in many different occasions. But when you think about doing what some of the citizen participants have suggested, which is trying to minimize the clutter of these facilities and having multiple facilities in a given area, one of the ways that you do that is you create more flexibility on where they can put these things and the kinds of facilities, either tall monopoles or shorter facilities. If you I recall some talk in one of the earlier meetings with the citizen committee and the industry group about, well, we shouldn't have these in open space or pristine areas. And if you just prohibit them in certain areas, that's going to have the effect of requiring more facilities in other areas. If you limit the height and say, you can't put a 150-foot pole in this particular zone district, it may be that a wireless applicant can get the same kind of coverage that they would need from that 150-foot pole by putting up 3 80-foot poles. Which is better? And I would suggest to you that in many cases, these are really going to be site-specific analyses. In one part of the county, you may say, I'd rather have a 150-foot pole and only have one facility covering this size of an area, as opposed to 3 80-foot towers covering the same area. Whereas in another part of the county, you might prefer to have 3 smaller facilities instead of one tower that might really damage an important view corridor. So you're asking really good questions, and you're probing exactly the issues that you ought to be probing. I would just encourage you to think about it's like pressing in on a balloon. Every time you squeeze in one area, something pops out in another area. And if one of the goals is to give the county decision makers as much flexibility as possible to minimize the pole clutter and to site these things in a way that looks if not as good, at least as least bad as it might look in a given area. The more you restrict it, the harder it's going to be to do that in certain spaces. So just a thought.
Thank you. Want to move on to your last slide?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a note because radio frequency testing was brought up and King County code was used as an example. And I did look into that and it was last updated in 1993. So it very well could be older than I am. And is a little outdated. Well, I don't know what month it is. And so I just wanted to make sure that I looked into it. But that I would not draft our code based on it.
And Kate, didn't you also say that some of the staff at King County said, we just don't enforce this anymore because we know it's not valid? Did I understand it
Yes.
correctly?
Yeah, that was what I was told. They're not able to actually enforce it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think
So
we gave you a little bit of a list of things to work on for us for next time.
Yeah.
But we are running a little bit late, so I think we're gonna move this forward, if that's all
Okay.
right. Thank
yeah,
you very
sounds
much.
great. Thank you.
Okay, we're gonna move on to agenda item number 6, a work session on docket code A27 non-conforming code updates with planner Ashley Arai.
Hello, good evening. Happy to be here tonight. Coming back after our June 1st briefing. Keep going. Ignore the technology. I want to focus on you. So at the June 1st meeting, the Planning Commission did request further information about the proposed concurrent review for the non-functioning buffer areas we've been talking about. As referred to in the memo and staff report dated June 15th, the following changes were made to the draft package of code amendments. As updated, that section for non-functioning buffer areas would now give staff the option of requiring concurrent technical review from any federal or state agency or applicable tribe, so really broadening that via that 2-week comment period. And then there was another concern about clarifying the review process that an applicant would have to go through. And so in talking to development services, we put in a reference to chapter 24.40, and that is the chapter of the critical areas ordinance that covers all of our critical area review permits. And this would be consistent with how development services currently processes requests for determinations of functionally isolated wetland buffers. That's a mouthful. But there is at least something in place for the current planners to use that they're familiar with. Finally, I checked in with development services and specifically Brett, who is with us tonight, to just see what the impact would be to have this concurrent review. And he indicated that it could be accommodated as part of that critical area review permit. So at this point, I know we are running out of time. It's been a long meeting, but if you have any specific questions for either me or Brad, we'd be happy to field those and then look forward to your recommendation.
I'd like to start down with Commissioner Day, if you had anything, since the first question was one that you brought up. So are you feeling all right with the updates?
I think I am. So I have actually been thinking a lot about this. I don't want to take us off track, but the more I think about this non-functioning buffer area, and if it's both biologically and hydrologically impaired, basically such that it doesn't contribute to the wetland, I have trouble thinking of any circumstance where that would be true unless it's like bedrock or currently impervious. Could we just say that? And then we've solved, I think, a lot of the kind of administrative pieces that just feel like they're going to be a hassle long-term. Because if there's a determinate, like you have to go, get somebody to tell you it's non-functioning, and then there's this process that you have to go through with either staff or like a hearings examiner in the other case, like that feels like it's really just going to frustrate people. And there's actually a really narrow, limited circumstance where it would be true. And maybe we just cite that limited circumstance where it's already impervious or like you can't infiltrate in that area where you're expanding the site.
So you mentioned wetlands, and that is an area where there already is a provision in the critical areas ordinance for these isolated buffer areas and more clear guidance than, let's say, like the riparian areas that we've been talking about previously. So I would want to make sure that we're not limiting this section beyond what the critical areas ordinance already provides for specifically for wetlands.
And I think the part of my concern is also in the fact that, I really believe in allowing people to, like what we're trying to do here, and like allowing people to make these either improvements or even expansions. I don't know if the piece that has really kept me up at night is are we gonna be adding impervious surface up to 500 square feet in these circumstances? And I think that's personally one that I would have trouble stomaching in this circumstance. But if what we're really talking about is places where you're not actually increasing the effective impervious surface, that solves the problem for me personally.
So you mentioned 500 square feet, and I just want to make sure you are aware that there's another section of that's pre-existing in the non-conforming structures, uses, lots that does reference an allowable expansion of 500 square feet. That we're not proposing to change, that's just what's there now. So I just want to, I didn't know if your reference to 500 square feet was in relation to that, or
my understanding is this creates a system where it's like an administrative staff review that it would have been a hearings examiner to do that in the past. Am I correct?
for that other for the 500
other-
square foot, that is something that is actually permitted.
I'm lost.
Is an allowed
It's allowed across
expansion.
the table. or
Yeah,
across
well,
the
no,
county.
not across, it's critical area review permit. So it's not just across the table. It's just not necessarily a reasonable use exception because it is set forth. And we're not proposing to change that section. I can give you the code reference for that.
I'm a little lost.
specific
I'm
one.
just truly lost. So are you talking about that you can expand a non-conforming structure by 500 square feet? under
Sorry, I'm
some
sorry.
other-
Actually, it's existing up to 500 square feet. Existing impervious surface. Let me get the actual code section because
Yeah.
it's not an area we've talked about because we're not proposing to change it. So I don't want to misrepresent something that
Okay.
I have not been poring over because I've been thinking a lot about
And
thinking
then,
a lot about the non-functioning buffer area
Yeah.
section.
and my read of it, my understanding of what this does, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is this moves the ability to expand by 500 feet from a hearings examiner to an administrative review. Is that incorrect or is that?
Or Chris, if you know the code section off the top of your head, because I printed it off in like super tiny letters that,
I will sit and find it. So if it's already in the non-conforming section or chapter of the critical areas ordinance,
Mhm.
then it's already an administrative permit. It does not go through an RUV. That makes sense.
Mhm.
So it is staff issued,
Well, I guess I'm confused
but it's not.
because I don't know this stuff really well, but the purpose of this change, isn't it to take stuff that currently has to get a reasonable use permit?
Correct.
And say it doesn't have to get a reasonable use permit anymore. And it's gonna be administrative, it's not gonna go to the hearing.
Right, it already didn't use.
yes, so in this case, it already didn't need a reasonable use exception. So it's section 24.50.025, if you're looking for it in your draft code. And so we're not proposing any changes of it, but essentially what it allows is that the approval authority may allow up to a 500 square foot expansion of impervious surface within a riparian area, wetland buffer, pond buffer, if it is determined that. And then there's a number of provisions that an applicant would have to conform to. That section of code, with the exception of some small tweaks here and there, we weren't substantively proposing any changes to that. So that is something that exists today that can go through administrative review. And that isn't necessarily behind a primary structure. It just can't be any closer to whatever that critical area is than the primary structure.
Okay.
So I didn't,
Well, I,
maybe I muddled things up. I would just didn't know because you were so specific with 500 square feet, whether you were referring to this other provision that currently exists.
okay.
Can I, well, are you done or?
I, yeah.
Do you
I
want to
think I'm done for
rethink?
now.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I'm kind of taking a different angle on it, maybe, or I'm not fully understanding the angle that's taken there, but I've been trying to think about this in terms of the conversations that we've had. And Christie's call for, think about ways to find a middle ground on this. I think for me, I went out and looked at other places, codes that try to get at the same thing, to just sort of look at how they're doing it. And what that helped me to understand is that what bothers me in particular about this one is that it's proposing to take stuff out of reasonable use permits and make it administrative, some kind of administrative permit. I'm not sure what kind, if it's a variance or an exemption or, I don't know. But some kind of other permit. And the place where I think we're tripping and it's getting more and more complicated is over this issue of it, how that there's this discretion, there's this effort to define, where can this happen and what is a functionally isolated zone, which I still think is not a, completely valid thing in terms of best available science. But what if it seems like other jurisdictions are able to do this in a slightly different way? And that is by just, instead of saying, well, if you want to do this little thing, and let's say it's not going to go, it's not going to create more impermeable surface or anything like that. You're not going to have an expansion where there's going to be a creation of more impermeable surface, or maybe you might want to allow just a little bit or whatever. But what if you just have blanket rules that don't require a determination, any kind of a scientific determination in order for it to happen? So in other words, you can say this is specifically about residential structures. It's not just about any non-conforming structures. It's specifically about single family homes. There were a number of things that were kind of ways of getting at this. So instead of talking about the substantive change stuff, you just say, yeah, you can build if it's more than, say, 500 square feet, or I think I saw maybe bigger areas or ones by if it's more than 10%, or if it's more than 1,000 square feet or something like that, then you have to mitigate. I saw in at least a couple of different codes, you can only do this once. So that kind of takes care of the, you don't keep fixing it up and living there forever, because the whole point is that you don't want people living in non-conforming areas. And the Department of Ecology and Commerce are both pretty firm that when you're thinking about critical areas, you have to admit there may come a time when the public interest is you really don't want people living there anymore. It could happen. So you don't want to sort of inadvertently encourage, continual improvements in perpetuity. You want to have some leeway there. So, so it seems like you can do this once, So there's all these different ways that you could just create rules, right? And just say, if it meets these rules, you can go ahead and make it an administrative change, but it doesn't require a judgment. The judgment comes when ecology says, yeah, go ahead and change it to be this rule. You have to consider cumulative impacts when you create the rule, not when, you've already done this 50 times and you're gonna do it another 50 times. So by kind of taking that, the subjective judgment out of it, and just having some rules, and having ecology say, yeah, those rules look good, we accept them, you've kind of solved a number of those problems. You've solved the cumulative impact problem. You've taken away the uncertainty. You've dealt with this, you know, how much is it gonna cost, and am I gonna go over that 50% threshold thing? You know, so it would require kind of going back to the drawing board a little bit, but I think that might be that pathway, you know, if it's just the rules that are written, you know, 500 square feet expansion, up, down, sideways, you have to mitigate, or some, you know, things like that. That might be the way to go, and it kind of keeps it from spinning out.
But I appreciate that you've looked at other counties. I started this project by delving into what other counties do, and a lot of them, especially with more updated critical areas ordinances, like in the last few years, have a lot more exemptions or exceptions for single family homes as they pertain, you know, if they're non-conforming in critical areas. So they do have those sort of overarching, you can expand up to 50% of the existing building footprint, or just a carte blanche 2,500 square foot expansion. Most of them are probably more lenient than what we currently have. And so I think as we were crafting this, it was kind of like, well, we're not going to go necessarily there from our 500 square feet to 2,500 square feet. And really looking more at site specific, if there is that existing impervious surface that would make a buffer area non-functioning, or using the example that we already have in the critical areas ordinance of our functionally isolated buffers for wetlands, and applying it specifically to non-conforming development. Because we do have precedent of, you know, 10 years of processing those permits and those determinations. And so there is, you know, that judgment is being used. And what if we apply it to non-conforming development as we're currently applying it to development within wetland areas? But that's the choice of the planning commission. You know, you don't necessarily have to embrace that, but that's at least the thinking that went into, you know, trying to limit it to just functionally isolated areas rather than just saying an allowance of greater than 500 square feet, which is currently in the code with mitigation. So that is the big difference, is that if it is a buffer area that is providing function, that 500 square foot expansion does require mitigation. That's written right into the code provisions.
I think we also got to remember too that there's more to critical areas than just wetlands. So this stuff would apply to others like steep slopes or.
The non-functioning is limited still.
Sure, but you know, we're not always just, critical areas aren't only protecting wetlands, they're protecting other areas too, where those kind of things would not really be a huge concern. Doug, I think you had something, didn't you? No. Well, I understand Commissioner Day's concerns. I'm not terribly interested in fresh start approach on this. I kind of like where this is at, where it's going, and I like that. I like that people will have options other than seeing a hearing or a reasonable use exemption hearing examiner, because that's an arduous process for something as simple as walling in a porch or whatever the other examples have been. So I personally am not needing any changes in what is there. I don't know if people are wanting to have more discussion on this or bring back any other information. But we are at a point where we could send this forward to the board if we wanted to. With that, I would entertain a motion if there is.
Like,
and if there's not a motion, that's fine too. We can ask some more questions and move this forward. We don't have a whole lot of time tonight. We're already running a little bit late.
And I feel bad I won't be here July 6th. You'd have to wait till July 20th to see me again.
Well, maybe we ought to wait. Maybe we ought to wait to think on this unless, well, I'm not
Maybe we
gonna.
ought to just move it. But I'm not gonna move it.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and make a motion, so we at least make a decision.
Second.
Very trusting.
You didn't write it in here. I move that we move the docket item 827 non-conforming code update to the Board of County Commissioners, to recommend to the Board of County Commissioners that recommend it to the Board of County Commissioners. Is that adequate?
Chris, is that motion
As
adequate?
proposed by staff.
As proposed by staff.
Yes.
It's been
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any further discussion?
Only that I anticipate writing a.
We'll get to that part. Being moved and seconded with no further discussion, we'll call for the vote on advancing the staff recommendation to the Board of County Commissioners on docket code 827 non-conforming code updates. Call for the vote.
Commissioner Casino,
Aye.
Commissioner Carmen,
Aye.
Commissioner Helverson,
Aye.
Commissioner Wheatley,
Nay.
Commissioner Hanson, Commissioner Simmons,
Aye.
Commissioner Day,
Nay.
Commissioner Passenger,
Nay.
Are we missing one?
Yeah.
Cool.
Fine.
Yeah, he's out.
He's still putting his kids to bed.
We have
Chris.
Scott, did you do it, Scott?
oh, Commissioner Nelson, sorry.
Aye.
I was blocking
all
it.
right. That's 5-3, so that will move forward. Now, the next question would
Yeah.
be, would any of the nays like to do a minority report?
Yeah.
Commissioner Wheatley, would you like to volunteer
It's
for
a
the
great
minority
learning
report?
experience.
So on your minority report, if you could please have it to Ashley by beginning of business on Monday, so she can
Okay.
forward it with the rest of our stuff. And if you need to coordinate with her.
Well, it would help to, are there templates or something? I mean, is there any?
So first of all, Monday is a federal holiday.
Oh, so you got an extra day.
So if you want to forward it, great, but we won't be.
So forward before business starts Tuesday, and to you, or to,
Oh, yeah, yeah, okay.
okay,
Yes.
Forward it to Ashley.
You can.
yeah. Is that okay with you,
All
Commissioner
right,
Wheeler?
and if anybody could be so kind as to think of what, if there's a good example
Could-
of how these are formatted.
Could you,
that would be helpful.
like Jennifer Davis had a minority report that she sent to me one time, so I could use that as a template when I did a minor. Could you dig one of those out and send it to her so she kind of
Yeah, that'd be
has an
great.
idea?
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that contentious but finished vote. And we'll look forward to seeing your minority report with that. So we will move on to our next agenda item, which is number 7, staff updates.
Staff has no updates.
None. Wow. Can you give us a report on your current staffing levels?
No change since the last meeting. Both the associate planners positions are still technically open.
And the planning manager position, or the, not the
No,
planning.
that's me.
Project coordinator position.
The community program ag manager position has closed, so technically it's still open.
And the senior planner position has been finalized?
The senior planner position has been finalized and Andy DeFocus was promoted.
Yay, thank you. Okay, with that, we'll go through our calendars. Our next scheduled meeting, where we are probably going to be talking about the wireless code update and then also chapter 20.35 emergency housing ordinance, will be July 6th. Is there anybody that does not believe they will be able to make that?
I might not.
Commissioner Wheatley is a maybe. After that, we will have our joint dinner with the Board of County Commissioners on July 14th, 2022, down at Mercato. Is there anybody that doesn't think they'd be able to make that?
The 14th and the 15th.
The 14th, Thursday, the 14th. I hope you guys can all make that one. That one's always really good. So I think everybody will be here for that one. Does anybody have anything for the good of the order?
Gonna ask about the 20th of July.
It's not on my list, but yeah, will anybody miss the 20th of July? Expected to miss the 20th of July? Kevin, do you have anything for the calendar?
I'll be there.
Great, thank you. Okay, I'll call for anything for the good of the order. Commissioner Wheatley.
One item, tomorrow evening, I believe, unless I'm wrong, the agricultural committee, what do you call it? The Agricultural Advisory Committee, I think, is taking on the agricultural uses and lands critical ordinance draft that we're going to be looking at.
Good.
Also, so if people want to preview tomorrow evening, I think it starts at 7 o'clock.
It'll be me.
Anything else for the good of the order? All right, well, having no further business, this meeting is adjourned.
Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.